we now invite Reverend George to give us his main talk to us. Reverend George.
Thanks again, Christopher. So as Christopher mentioned when he started talking about this, UU congregations have in the past, they've been communities where hope has been cultivated and sustained among us. For those of you who've been around for a while, you know this. And the moniker Houses of Hope is true whether these congregations have owned buildings or not. I know I started with Lakeshore when the congregation didn't own a building, and then we did for the rest of the time I was there, and it didn't seem to make that much of a difference except in how much work it was to set up the chairs. So Houses of Hope, we've been that, and I hope that we are that. We are havens of mutual care and respect, and beacons of religious and spiritual freedom and free inquiry, and lots of other good stuff. And I haven't been around this congregation for a while, but I know certainly that was true of you all in the past, and the reports I've heard and the things I read on in your newsletter and website would say that you still are. So all good. Now, question is, can RU congregations continue to be houses of hope? It's a tough world and it's getting tougher. Christopher mentioned the pandemic, and we're all dealing with that, and including in the way that this service has to be presented. And then there's climate change and conflict over scarce resources. I don't know about the rest of you, but I was saddened by how little came out in the COP26 report. Our prospects are not necessarily all that good coming out of that. And with all of that, I believe that yes, we can continue to be houses of hope, our congregations. Even in the face of all the predicaments we face, all the problems humanity faces, I believe our liberal religious congregations continue to be communities of freedom, love, and justice. Now this takes some description, but I believe that's true, and here's how. I believe, along with Dr. King, and I've been studying this for decades, that the beloved community as an ideal is one that we should and can continue to aspire to. And this was the community of love and justice that Dr. King taught us about, and his voice still stands, certainly in my heart, telling us more about it. The love that when I say beloved community, the love that I'm thinking about here is our willingness to extend ourselves for the long-term well-being of another person or a community, and for our own self-love too, for our own well-being. And I want to talk about that. Now, one of Dr. King's supporters, Cornel West, an American thinker and public intellectual, talked about justice in relation to love, and he put it very well. He said, justice is what love looks like in public. I still believe that we can hope for the beloved community with both love in the close-in sense and justice in the broader sense, in our congregations, in our nations, and in all the communities around us. Now, it's important to distinguish two kinds of hope, or two definitions of hope. And I'm using the Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. They wrote a book called Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And I think that applies. And they said there's two kinds of hope. There's where we consider the desirable outcome and say that we're more hopeful if this outcome is more likely. So I could say that I'm hopeful that a certain Montreal hockey team will win the Stanley Cup this year. But there isn't a lot that I can do about that. Or we can practice what they call and I call active hope, where we actively desire an outcome and we're willing to take action and change our approaches to make this outcome more likely. So imagine it's spring, and I know it's not spring, it's going the other way, but work with me here. And I've got a backyard where I've just planted a vegetable garden, and I can vaguely hope suggest that hope the vegetables will flourish and produce lots of food, and maybe my hope is justified because we had many rainy days last summer, right? Or I can start watering and weeding and checking soil chemistry and start planning for more of all of that. If I did take this approach, I engaging in what's called active hope. Macy and Johnstone identify active hope as a practice. Like Tai Chi and gardening, it's something we do rather than something we have. Or to follow what the Bengeson's saying, hope is not a feeling, it's an action. And I know there's feelings that are associated with hope, but fundamentally what I'm driving on here is that the hope that we can work on in our communities and in ourselves is an action. And it's something we do rather than something we have. Now, Macy and Johnstone also point out that it's possible to practice active hope on a project, no matter what the starting odds of success are. So for my garden example, for instance, I could be doing an experimental planting that I haven't done before, I haven't grown before, or I could be doing it on rocky soil and I'm not sure how things are going to work. So there might be substantial risk that the crop will not flourish, but I can still be actively hopeful. What are some examples of this? I'm thinking of the approach of winter, for instance, which I know you'll laugh, but we do have winter here in Ohio as well as the Montreal winter. But for winter, I often, when I think of it, I think of the wise philosopher Gilles Vigneault, who said, "Mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver. Mon jardin, ce n'est pas un jardin, c'est de la neige." And that's what both in Montreal and in Ohio we're faced with, is a fair bit of snow and winter. So we can't be actively hopeful about winter because it's just gonna happen. What we can do is work to ensure that all people, including those who are less fortunate in our communities, have warm clothing, enough food, and safe housing during the winter. We can actively hope for that kind of thing. Now let's run down this list, because there's some things that this hope is not, the way I'm talking about it. So it's not hope for an afterlife. I believe our communal work is for the beloved community in this life, here on this beloved earth of ours. And this makes me, I think, probably a fairly typical UU, although you folks will tell me whether I am or not. But if you want to work on hope for what comes after, you'd have to get a different minister in to talk to you. That's not me. Nor is it hope for a sure thing. We talked about that you know, the garden can fail. We can try to make sure everybody's got a snowsuit this winter, but maybe we don't get to everybody. So it's not hope for a sure thing, but it's still worth trying, very carefully thinking about what our goals are and what we hope for, and then setting to work on them. And it's not optimism about the future in general. And I make a clear distinction, and not everybody agrees with me, but I make a clear distinction between active hope and optimism. So optimism applies to the Stanley Cup for a team with red, white, and blue on their jerseys. Hope applies to getting kids into snowsuits, active hope. And this might be some of the most difficult work on this one. Hope now is not for a middle-class future. Another American thinker who follows Dr. King, Brian Stevenson, he said it in a way that I like. He said the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but justice. The opposite of poverty is not wealth, but justice. And Brian Stevenson was the one who established the memorial to in Birmingham, Alabama, to all the lynching that happened in the South. I think of it in very particular terms with my own grandchildren. My wife and I have 3 grandsons under 10. And my goal with them, my hope for them, is to work to cultivate a just and loving family and community for them. And by extension, all the young folks their age coming up all over the world. I am pretty sure that they're not going to have the same sort of comfort and choices that I had growing up as a privileged kid in the Lakeshore in the 1950s and 1960s. But I still believe that I can and we can work towards a just and loving community for them. So for those of you like me who are in the middle class, sometimes letting go of those middle class expectations is among the hardest, some of the hardest work that we have to do in this new world. We can still be hopeful, but maybe we can't hope for the things that our parents or our grandparents hoped for. And this is where the wisdom of Indigenous folks comes in. And I am just so pleased that you folks are starting to work on this. I mean, I'm just an expat who hasn't made it home yet. I won't be in Canada till next year, but you're already doing this work. And I see you've got a meeting where you're going to work on, you know, supportive resolutions for some of what the commission recommended, and so and some other related things. And I just so admire you for that. And I hope that next year, when I'm back in Canada, I'll be able to be doing some of that work. Robin Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, she quoted from a Haudenosaunee elder, an American tribal elder, who was musing, and he said, you know, looking at all these white people, it's interesting. They seem like they've still got one foot on the boat, by which he meant that, and he was looking at the settler communities around him, that there were a lot of folks who were acting like they were going to try it here, but if the trees got all cut down or the mine ran out, they would then be ready to go someplace else. And of course, and you know, I have to be careful saying this because I left Montreal when I could to get a better job, and you know, and haven't come back. So I may not have had one foot on the boat, but I had one foot on the moving van to Ottawa. So, and I'm now trying to come back. I'm now trying to come back, and commit both feet to a particular place. So if there's a message here, all of the sermon is for everybody, but there was a message here for those of you who don't identify as Indigenous. It's to think carefully about how you can organize your life so that you have both feet on the ground where you are. You don't have one foot on the boat. So that's the end of my message for white people. I want to talk about something that the Banksons said. They said, hope is where the hurt is. And I believe that. Hope is where the love is, and the hurt is there as well. There's so much pain and suffering in the world. And some of this pain is among us. We heard that. Many are grieving or afraid or angry, and legitimately so. Now, a community such as this one cannot remove the hurt, but we can be the ones to listen, to hold, and to nurture. And you folks here are already doing this. I know that. So hope is where the hurt is, but it's also where the love is. And I want to make a last point before I conclude. There's times in my own life where I've allowed my first world kind of troubles and doubt to overwhelm my self-care, which is not a good plan, as you can all attest. Jesus of Nazareth, who's a very wise person, he said, love your neighbor as yourself. Not more than, not less than. The just and loving world we hope for, the beloved community, this will be cultivated and sustained and grown by those who are finding ways to creatively balance self-care and care for others, even in the most difficult and troubling days. And I know this truth about self-care in my deepest heart, and still sometimes I let troubles and doubt overwhelm me. My heart sometimes needs a little help to remember, to sing my heart's own song. And hence, as so often with ministers, I'm preaching the sermon that I need to hear. So hence the sermon. In working on preparing the sermon, I noticed your website and this wonderful, you've got many short, wonderful things. One of them at the top says, nurturing wonder, living with integrity, inspiring action. Yes, yes. So to conclude, I would say, I hope and pray this congregation and this gathered community will continue as a place to sustain us as we live with integrity, as we nurture wonder and inspire action towards the beloved community. May it be so.